April 13th, 1944. 5:47 in the evening. The Texas sun was still high, baking the dirt roads outside Camp Hood into dust. Inside a military bus headed toward the town of Killeen, Second Lieutenant Jackie Robinson sat in the middle row, uniform pressed, insignia polished. He was 25 years old, an officer in the United States Army, sworn to defend democracy against fascism. But when the bus driver turned around and barked at him to move to the back, Robinson didn't budge. What happened next would trigger a court-martial that nearly destroyed his career before it began. It would expose the brutal contradiction at the heart of America's war effort, that black soldiers were expected to die for freedoms they were denied at home. And it would reveal that sometimes the most dangerous battle wasn't fought on foreign soil, but in the space between what America claimed to be and what it actually was. This is the story of how one man's refusal to obey an unjust order became a turning point, not just for him, but for the fight against segregation in the military. A fight that would take courage, witnesses, and a legal battle that could have ended everything. Jackie Robinson would later become famous for breaking baseball's color barrier, but 3 years before that, on a hot Texas evening, he faced a different kind of line, one drawn not on a field, but inside the very army that claimed to represent freedom. Jackie Robinson was not supposed to be an officer. In 1942, when he was drafted into the United States Army, the military was still deeply segregated. Black soldiers were relegated to support roles, loading supplies, digging latrines, building roads. They were rarely allowed into combat units. They were almost never given leadership positions. The message was clear: black men could serve, but they could not lead. Robinson had grown up in Pasadena, California, the youngest of 5 children raised by a single mother who worked as a domestic labourer. He was a natural athlete, excelling in football, basketball, track and baseball at UCLA. But when the war came, none of that mattered. He was just another black man in a segregated army. At Fort Riley, Kansas, Robinson applied for officer candidate school. He was initially denied, not because of his qualifications, but because of his race. It wasn't until the heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis, who was also stationed at Fort Riley, intervened and used his influence to push the issue that Robinson was finally admitted. In January 1943, he graduated as a second lieutenant and was assigned to a cavalry unit. But even as an officer, Robinson found himself navigating a system designed to remind him of his place. He was barred from the base's officers' club. He was refused service at the post exchange. When he tried to join the base baseball team, he was told it was for whites only. The irony was suffocating. He wore the uniform of a nation at war with tyranny, yet faced tyranny every single day. By the summer of 1944, Robinson had been transferred to Camp Hood, Texas, a sprawling military installation outside Killeen. He was assigned to the 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black unit nicknamed the Black Panthers. The men there respected him. He didn't talk down to them. He didn't tolerate disrespect from anyone, regardless of rank or race. But that refusal to bow would soon cost him everything. On the evening of April 13th, Robinson was riding a military bus back to base after visiting the hospital to check on an injury. He sat down in the middle of the bus next to Virginia Jones, the wife of a fellow black officer. The bus was not full. There were empty seats in the back, but to the white bus driver, that didn't matter. What mattered was the colour of Robinson's skin. The driver glanced into his rearview mirror and saw Robinson sitting in the middle section. He slowed the bus, turned his head and said, "Hey you, get to the back where you belong." Robinson looked up. He didn't move. The driver repeated himself, louder this time. "I said move to the back." Robinson's jaw tightened. He knew the regulations. Just months earlier, the Army had issued a directive prohibiting racial discrimination on military buses operating on federal installations. The order was clear: seating could not be segregated, but Texas was not interested in federal orders. Local custom ruled here, and local custom meant black soldiers sat in the back. Robinson spoke calmly but firmly. "I'm not moving. I have every right to sit here." The driver's face reddened. He stopped the bus completely and stood up. Other passengers turned to watch. Some shifted uncomfortably, A few white soldiers muttered under their breath. Virginia Jones, sitting next to Robinson, whispered, "Jack, maybe we should just—" "No," Robinson said. His voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. "I'm not moving." The standoff lasted several minutes. The driver, realizing Robinson would not comply, radioed ahead to the base military police. When the bus arrived at Camp Hood, 2 white MPs were waiting. They boarded the bus and approached Robinson. One of them, a captain, looked at him with thinly veiled contempt. "You causing trouble, Lieutenant?" Robinson stood up slowly, deliberately. "No, sir. I was sitting in a seat I'm legally entitled to sit in." The captain's eyes narrowed. "You need to come with us." Robinson was escorted off the bus and taken to the MP station. What should have been a routine complaint turned into an interrogation. The questions were hostile, accusatory. "Why did you refuse to move? Why did you talk back to the driver? Do you think the rules don't apply to you?" Robinson answered each question with the same calm precision. He had done nothing wrong. The bus driver had violated army regulations. He had simply refused to comply with an illegal order. But the officers questioning him weren't interested in regulations. They were interested in discipline. And to them, a black officer, refusing a white civilian's order was insubordination no matter what the rulebook said. By the end of the night, Robinson was formally charged with insubordination, disturbing the peace, and conduct unbecoming an officer. A court-martial was scheduled. His military career, which had barely begun, now hung by a thread. What Robinson didn't know yet was that this moment would become a test case, not just for him, but for every black soldier who had ever been told to stay in their place. The trial that followed would expose the deep hypocrisy of a nation fighting fascism abroad while enforcing racism at home, and it would force the army to answer a question it had been avoiding since the war began. Could a black man truly be an officer in an institution that refused to treat him as one? The trial was set for August 2nd, 1944, at Camp Hood's military courtroom. The atmosphere was tense. Word had spread quickly through the black units on base. Jackie Robinson, the former UCLA star, the officer who didn't back down, was being tried for something most of them had experienced themselves, being told to know their place. The courtroom was packed. 9 officers sat on the panel, all of them white. The prosecutor was a white captain with a reputation for being thorough and unforgiving. Robinson's defense attorney was a white lieutenant named William Klein, a man with little trial experience but a genuine belief that the charges were absurd. The Army's case was straightforward. The bus driver, Milton Renegar, testified first. He claimed that Robinson had been drunk and disorderly, that he had cursed at him, and that he had refused a direct order to move to the back of the bus. Renegar painted Robinson as belligerent, aggressive, a troublemaker who thought he was above the rules. Next came the MPs who had questioned Robinson. They corroborated the driver's account, adding their own embellishments. One claimed Robinson had been uppity. Another said he had used profane language. The implication was clear. This was not about seating. This was about a black man who refused to show deference to white authority. The prosecutor leaned heavily on the word insubordination. He argued that regardless of what the regulations said, Robinson had caused a disruption. He had escalated a situation that could have been resolved quietly. He had shown disrespect to a civilian employee of the military and refused to comply with the instructions of military police. In the prosecutor's framing, the issue wasn't race, it was discipline. But then the defense began. Lieutenant Klein called his first witness, Virginia Jones, the woman who had been sitting next to Robinson on the bus. She testified clearly and without hesitation. Robinson had not been drunk. He had not cursed. He had been polite, firm, but never disrespectful. The bus driver had been the one who escalated the situation, not Robinson. Klein then called several other witnesses, black soldiers who had been on the bus or nearby. Each one told the same story. Robinson had done nothing wrong. He had simply refused to comply with an order that violated army policy. The driver had been the aggressor, not the lieutenant. Finally, Robinson himself took the stand. He was calm, articulate, and precise. He recounted the events of that evening without emotion, sticking to the facts. He acknowledged that he had refused to move. He did not apologize for it. He explained that he knew the regulations, that he knew segregation on military buses was prohibited, and that he had acted within his rights. The prosecutor tried to rattle him. "Lieutenant Robinson, do you think you're special? Do you think the rules don't apply to you?" Robinson looked him in the eye. "No, sir. I think the rules apply to everyone, including bus drivers." The courtroom fell silent. It was a simple answer, but it landed like a hammer, because the truth was undeniable. The regulations were on Robinson's side. The bus driver had violated Army policy. Robinson had not. The trial lasted 2 days. The panel of officers deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: not guilty on all charges. Robinson walked out of that courtroom a free man. But the victory was bittersweet, because while he had won his case, the system that had put him on trial in the first place remained unchanged. The same racism that had led to his arrest was still embedded in every corner of military life, and Robinson knew that for every trial he won, there were 1,000 others who never got the chance to fight back. Jackie Robinson's court-martial did not happen in a vacuum. It was part of a broader brutal reality facing black soldiers during World War II. They were told they were fighting for freedom, for democracy, for the American way of life. But at home, they were denied those same freedoms at every turn. The Double V campaign, launched by the black press in 1942, captured this contradiction perfectly. Victory abroad against fascism. Victory at home against racism. Black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender published stories every week about black soldiers being attacked, humiliated and murdered, often by white civilians or military police, sometimes in uniform. In Louisiana, a black soldier named Private Felix Hall was found hanged from a tree near Fort Benning in 1941. The Army ruled it a suicide. His family knew better. In South Carolina, Isaac Woodard, a black sergeant returning home from the war in 1946, was beaten and blinded by police officers after he asked to use a restroom. He was still in uniform. At Camp Van Dorn in Mississippi, white MPs shot and killed a black soldier named Private William Walker in 1943 after a dispute over a segregated bus. The official report called it justifiable. No one was charged. These were not isolated incidents. They were the norm. Black soldiers stationed in the South faced constant harassment. They were barred from restaurants, movie theatres, and even base facilities. German prisoners of war held in camps across the southern United States were often treated better than black American soldiers. They were allowed to eat in whites-only diners. They were served before black troops. The irony was not lost on anyone. Robinson's case was different only in that it went to trial and that he won. But the forces that brought him to that courtroom were the same forces that silenced, brutalized, and killed countless others. The military justice system was designed to enforce order, not justice. And order in a segregated army meant keeping black soldiers in their place. Yet something was beginning to shift. The war had forced black soldiers into roles they had been denied before. The Tuskegee Airmen flew combat missions over Europe with distinction. The 761st Tank Battalion, the unit Robinson had been assigned to before his court-martial, would go on to fight in the Battle of the Bulge and earn commendations for valour. Black soldiers were proving over and over that they were just as capable, just as brave, just as deserving as their white counterparts. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. How could America claim to be fighting for freedom while denying it to its own citizens? How could the military ask black men to die for democracy while refusing to grant them basic dignity? Robinson's trial had exposed that contradiction in a way that was impossible to dismiss. The charges against him were legally baseless. The verdict had proven that. But the fact that he had been charged at all revealed the rot at the core of the system. And for many black soldiers watching from the sidelines, it was a reminder that the fight for equality would not be won on the battlefield alone. It would be won in courtrooms, in protests, in the slow, grinding work of forcing America to live up to its ideals. Robinson's victory was small, but it mattered, because it showed that resistance was possible, that standing up, even when it cost you everything, could still lead to justice. Not always, not easily, but sometimes, and sometimes was enough to keep fighting. When Jackie Robinson was acquitted, he was not celebrated, he was not promoted. He was quietly transferred out of the 761st Tank Battalion and reassigned to a different unit. The official reason was administrative. The real reason was that the army wanted him gone. He had become a symbol, and symbols were dangerous. Robinson never saw combat. In November 1944, he was honourably discharged due to a pre-existing ankle injury. He left the military with no medals, no commendations, and no fanfare. But he left with something else, a clarity about the kind of country he was living in. Years later, Robinson would say that his time in the army had radicalised him, not in the sense of making him violent or extreme, but in making him unwilling to accept injustice quietly. The trial had shown him that the system was rigged, but also that it could be challenged, that even in a courtroom stacked against him, the truth could win if he stood firm. In 1945, Robinson signed with the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro Leagues. 2 years later, he broke baseball's color barrier when he joined the Brooklyn Dodgers. The courage he showed on that bus in Texas would echo in every step he took onto a major league field. The same refusal to back down, the same insistence on his dignity, the same belief that the rule should apply to everyone, including him. But Robinson never forgot the soldiers who didn't get their day in court, the ones who were beaten, arrested, or killed for standing up. He spoke about them often, especially in his later years when he became an outspoken advocate for civil rights. He knew that his story was not unique, it was just one of thousands. And he knew that his victory, as significant as it felt in the moment, was only the beginning. It would take 3 more years after Robinson's discharge for the military to begin dismantling segregation. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of the armed forces. It was a historic moment, but it did not happen overnight. Many units remained segregated well into the Korean War. Resistance from white officers was fierce. Change came slowly, grudgingly, and only because black soldiers and activists refused to let the issue die. The court-martial of Jackie Robinson played a small but significant role in that change. It became a case study in the absurdity of segregation. Legal scholars and civil rights advocates pointed to it as evidence that the military's racial policies were not just unjust, but unenforceable. If an officer could be charged for refusing an order that violated army regulations, then the regulations themselves were meaningless. The trial also highlighted the courage required to resist. Robinson had everything to lose: his career, his reputation, even his freedom. But he refused to bend, and in doing so, he showed other black soldiers that resistance was possible, that they didn't have to accept humiliation as the price of service. The legacy of that moment extended far beyond the military. The same legal strategies used to defend Robinson would later be used in civil rights cases challenging segregation in schools, housing, and public accommodations. The same moral argument that American ideals demanded equality, not just in theory, but in practice, would become the foundation of the civil rights movement. Robinson himself would become one of the movement's most prominent voices. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr., he spoke at rallies, he used his platform as a baseball legend to advocate for justice. And he never stopped reminding people that the fight for equality was not just about laws, it was about dignity, about being treated as a human being, not a second-class citizen. In 1997, 50 years after Robinson broke baseball's colour, barrier, Major League Baseball retired his number, 42, across all teams. It was an unprecedented honour, but Robinson's real legacy was not in the record books. It was in the lives he touched, the barriers he broke, and the courage he showed when it mattered most. The story of Jackie Robinson's court-martial is not a story about heroism in the traditional sense. He didn't charge into battle. He didn't save lives under fire. He didn't perform an act of extraordinary physical courage. What he did was simpler and, in some ways, harder. He refused to accept an injustice, and he paid the price for it. That refusal, that willingness to stand firm even when the consequences were severe, is what made Robinson's story resonate. Because, the truth is, most acts of courage are not dramatic. They are quiet, personal, and costly. They happen in moments when no one is watching, when the easy choice is to comply and the hard choice is to resist. Robinson's story is also a reminder of the contradictions that have always existed at the heart of American identity. The United States went to war in 1941, claiming to fight for freedom and democracy. But at home, millions of black Americans were denied those same freedoms. They could not vote in many states, they could not eat in the same restaurants as whites, they could not attend the same schools, and when they served in the military they were treated as inferior even as they risked their lives. That contradiction did not end with World War II. It persists today in different forms, in different systems, but the lesson of Robinson's story remains the same. Change does not come from waiting for the system to fix itself. It comes from people who refuse to accept injustice, even when the cost is high. Robinson could have moved to the back of the bus. He could have avoided the confrontation, the trial, the risk to his career. No one would have blamed him. But he didn't. And in that refusal, he set in motion a chain of events that would ripple through history. The bus incident at Camp Hood was not the moment that changed everything. But it was a moment, one of many, and those moments, accumulated over time by people who refused to stay silent, are what eventually forced systems to change. Jackie Robinson's court-martial is not widely remembered today. It is overshadowed by his achievements in baseball, by his role in the civil rights movement, by the legend he became. But for those who know the story, it stands as a testament to a different kind of courage. The courage to say no when everyone expects you to say yes. The courage to stand alone when it would be easier to blend in. The courage to believe that the rules should apply to everyone, including you. And that courage, quiet and unglamorous as it may be, is what makes history move forward.